They say genius doesn't age, but hearts do. Prince had learned this lesson the hard way through decades of failed relationships, bitter divorces, and the kind of loneliness that comes from being worshipped by millions, but truly known by almost no one. He had sworn off serious relationships, convinced that his art was a jealous lover that demanded everything. Then in 2011, a young actress named Andy Allo auditioned for his band, and every wall he'd built around his heart began to crack. She didn't know his catalog by heart. She didn't treat him like an untouchable icon. She challenged him, questioned him, and somehow made him feel like a man instead of a legend. For 2 years, the 29-year age gap between them became invisible. Until suddenly, it became everything. What transformed their relationship from fairy tale to heartbreak wasn't what the tabloids reported, but something far more painful that happened behind the purple walls of Paisley Park. If you want to discover more untold stories about Prince's private world, hit that subscribe button and join us on this journey through music history's most guarded secrets. At 52, Prince had reached a point in his career where every move felt calculated, every album release measured against an impossible legacy. The spontaneity that had once defined his genius now felt like a distant memory, something that belonged to a younger man who believed he could change the world with nothing but a guitar and an attitude. Prince had conquered music, film, fashion, and the entire industry that tried to control him. That's when Andy Allo walked into his life. She was 23, fresh-faced and fearless, in the way only someone at the beginning of their journey can be. When she auditioned for a spot in the new Power Generation, Prince's backing band, she arrived with a guitar, a voice that could shift from vulnerable to powerful in a single breath, and absolutely no idea that she was about to audition for the most demanding perfectionist in music history. Most musicians who entered Prince's orbit came already worshiping at his altar, their nervousness making them stumble over chords they'd played 1,000 times before. Andy was different. She played with the casual excellence of someone who hadn't yet learned to doubt herself. And when Prince corrected her technique, she didn't nod reverently and comply. She asked him why. She challenged his arrangement choices. She treated him like a collaborator instead of a deity. Prince found this absolutely intoxicating. For years, he'd been surrounded by yes-men and women, people so grateful to be in his presence that they'd lost the ability to push back, to offer genuine creative friction. Andy Allo didn't know she was supposed to be intimidated, and that ignorance became her greatest asset. Within weeks of joining the band, she wasn't just playing backup. Prince was writing songs specifically for her voice, building arrangements that showcased her abilities, spending hours in the studio perfecting tracks that would become her debut album under his guidance. But something else was happening in those long studio sessions, something neither of them had planned for and neither could control. The transformation from mentor to lover didn't happen overnight. Prince had mentored dozens of artists over his career, from Sheila E. to Vanity, to Carmen Electra. He had a pattern, a process that usually involved intense creative collaboration mixed with flirtation, romance, and eventually dissolution when the artist wanted independence, or when Prince's attention shifted to the next project. Andy seemed like she would follow the same trajectory. Prince gave her a new look, styled her image, produced her album Superconductor, and brought her on tour as part of the new Power Generation. He was creating her in his image, the way he'd done with so many protégés before. But Andy refused to be just another Prince creation. During rehearsals, she'd argue about set lists, suggesting changes that Prince initially dismissed but later incorporated. At Paisley Park, where Prince's word was usually absolute law, Andy somehow carved out space for her own voice. Staff members watched in amazement as she teased him about his obsessive perfectionism, calling him out when he was being unreasonable, making him laugh in a way they hadn't heard in years. The age difference that should have created an unbridgeable gap instead became irrelevant. When they were writing music together, bent over a keyboard or trading guitar riffs at 3 in the morning, they weren't 52 and 23. They were just two artists speaking the only language that truly mattered to either of them. Prince began opening up to Andy in ways he rarely did with anyone. He spoke about the pain of losing his son, boy Gregory, just 7 days after birth, a tragedy that had haunted him for over a decade. He confessed his fears about aging, about becoming irrelevant in an industry that worships youth, about wondering if his best work was behind him. Andy listened without judgment, without the starry-eyed worship that usually characterized people's interactions with Prince. She shared her own vulnerabilities, her immigrant experience, her struggles with identity, her fears about being molded into someone else's vision instead of discovering her own. These late-night conversations, happening in the sacred space of Prince's private studio, created an intimacy that went far beyond physical attraction. By 2012, their relationship had evolved into something that confused everyone around them, including Andy and Prince themselves. They were collaborators, mentor and student, friends, and increasingly, lovers. Prince, who had sworn off serious relationships, found himself falling into patterns he'd promised himself he'd never repeat. He was possessive, demanding, jealous when Andy paid attention to other band members. Yet he was also more vulnerable than his inner circle had ever seen him, more willing to compromise, more openly affectionate. For Andy, the relationship was a whirlwind that promised everything a young artist could dream of. Fame, mentorship from a legend, love that felt destined. Prince's fame opened doors she couldn't have accessed on her own. His genius pushed her to heights she didn't know she could reach. But there was a price being paid, one that wouldn't become clear until much later. Living in Prince's world meant following Prince's rules. Paisley Park wasn't just a recording studio. It was a self-contained universe where normal concepts of time, boundaries, and personal space didn't apply. Prince famously worked at all hours, calling musicians for sessions at 2 in the morning, expecting everyone to be available whenever inspiration struck. His Jehovah's Witness faith, which he'd adopted in 2001, influenced every aspect of life at Paisley Park. From the conversations that were acceptable to the content of the music being created. For a while, Andy embraced it all. She moved into Prince's world completely, letting his rhythms become her rhythms, his beliefs shape her choices, his vision define her career. The album Prince produced for her, Superconductor, released in November 2012, was a masterpiece that showcased both his production genius and her raw talent. Critics praised it as one of Prince's best protégé projects in years, noting how he'd managed to highlight Andy's unique voice rather than simply making her sound like a female version of himself. She toured with the new power generation, performing to crowds who were initially there for Prince, but left talking about her. But behind the success, cracks were forming that neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Prince's need for control, which had driven away so many previous partners and collaborators, began asserting itself in ways that made Andy uncomfortable. He wanted input on what she wore, who she talked to, how she presented herself on social media. His jealousy flared when other band members got too friendly with her, leading to tensions within the group. Most significantly, Prince expected Andy to subordinate her own artistic vision to his, to trust his judgment completely, even when her instincts told her something different. This was the paradox of being Prince's lover and protégé. He was attracted to her independent spirit, her willingness to challenge him, yet he couldn't fully accept those same qualities when they threatened his control. Andy found herself caught between gratitude and growing resentment. How do you push back against someone who's given you everything? How do you assert your independence from a man who's literally creating your career? The age gap, which had seemed irrelevant when they were collaborating on music, became more apparent in these moments of conflict. Prince had decades of experience, an established legacy, the confidence that comes from being proven right more often than not. Andy was still figuring out who she was, what she believed, what kind of artist she wanted to become. Every disagreement felt unequal, every argument weighted by the reality that Prince held all the power in their relationship, professional and personal. Friends outside Paisley Park began expressing concern. They saw Andy changing, saw her spark dimming as she molded herself to fit Prince's world. But Andy defended the relationship fiercely. Besides, she loved him. Not the icon, not the legend, but the man who made her laugh at 4 in the morning, who wrote her songs that captured feelings she didn't know she had, who looked at her like she was the most fascinating person in the world. That version of Prince made everything else bearable, until it didn't. The end, when it came, wasn't dramatic. There was no explosive fight, no public scandal, no betrayal that made headlines. Instead, it was a quiet dissolution that hurt more than any dramatic ending could have. By early 2013, after 2 years of intense collaboration and romance, Andy realized something that terrified her. She was disappearing. Not literally, but the version of herself she'd been before Prince, the person with her own dreams and vision and voice, was fading into the background. She'd become so accustomed to asking, "What would Prince do?" that she'd stopped asking, "What do I want?" Her career was thriving in ways she'd never imagined possible. But it was thriving on Prince's terms, following Prince's vision, existing within Prince's ecosystem. The realization hit her during a recording session. Prince was producing a new track for her, and as always, his instincts were brilliant. The arrangement was gorgeous, the production impeccable. But it wasn't what Andy had imagined when she'd written the song. She'd envisioned something raw, more stripped down, more reflective of the indie rock influences that had shaped her before Prince. She tried to explain her vision, but Prince dismissed it with the casual confidence of someone who knew his way was better. And he was probably right. His version would likely be more commercially successful, more polished, more impressive to critics. But it wouldn't be hers. In that moment, Andy understood that staying with Prince meant accepting that she would always be his creation, his protege, his project. She would be successful, probably more successful than she could be on her own. But she would never know who Andy Allo the artist really was, separate from Prince's influence. What happened next would define both of their lives in ways neither expected, and the truth behind their split would remain hidden until Prince's death years later revealed just how deeply he'd loved her and how much losing her had cost him. The conversation, when Andy finally asked for it, took place in the same studio where they'd first connected. But she was more terrified of losing herself completely, of waking up at 30 or 40 and realizing she'd lived someone else's life. Prince listened as she explained her need for independence, her desire to discover her own artistic voice, her gratitude for everything he'd given her, but her certainty that she needed to step away. His face remained unreadable, that mask of cool detachment he'd perfected over decades of guarding his emotions. When she finished, he simply nodded and said he understood. No anger, no pleading, no dramatic reaction, just acceptance. But those close to Prince saw something different in the weeks that followed. The man who rarely showed vulnerability to anyone seemed hollowed out, going through the motions of his daily routine without the spark that usually animated him. He threw himself into work with even more intensity than usual, spending days at a time in the studio, barely sleeping, barely eating. One day she was there, integral to the new power generation and his life. The next, it was as if she'd never existed, her absence marked only by the songs he'd written for her that he could no longer perform. Years later, after Prince's death in 2016, Andy would speak more openly about their relationship. In interviews, she described him as her mentor, her teacher, someone who'd shown her what was possible when you committed completely to your art. She spoke about the impossible position of loving someone who was both a man and a mythology, someone whose genius was inseparable from his need for control. She revealed that Prince had continued reaching out to her occasionally after their split, cryptic messages that suggested he'd never fully let go, that some part of him was still waiting for her to return to Paisley Park. The last message came just months before his death. A simple text asking how she was doing, if she was happy, if her music was fulfilling her in ways he couldn't. Andy never responded to that final message. By then, she'd built her own career on her own terms. landing roles in television shows like Upload, and releasing music that reflected her unique vision rather than anyone else's. She'd proven she could succeed outside Prince's shadow, that she was more than just another protege. But reading that last message after his death broke something in her. She realized he'd been reaching out, perhaps wanting reconciliation or closure, or simply to hear her voice one more time. And she'd been too proud, too committed to her independence, too afraid of being pulled back into his orbit to respond. The tragedy of Prince and Andy Allo's relationship wasn't that it ended. Relationships end all the time, especially when they're built on such unequal foundations of power, age, and experience. The tragedy was that both of them were right. Prince was right, that his mentorship could accelerate Andy's career in ways nothing else could, that his genius could help her access heights she might never reach alone. Andy was right that staying meant sacrificing her own identity, that she needed independence to discover who she really was as an artist. There was no version of their relationship where both of those truths could coexist. Someone had to compromise, someone had to sacrifice, and ultimately, both of them did. For Prince, Andy represented something he'd been chasing his entire life without realizing it. Not another protege, not another romance, but a genuine partnership with someone who saw him as human rather than mythological. Andy was different. She'd come to him more fully formed, with her own experiences, her own worldview, her own artistic instincts. That independence was what attracted him. But it was also what made their relationship impossible. Prince couldn't be in a relationship without being in control, and Andy couldn't maintain her sense of self while giving him that control. In the years between their split and his death, Prince never publicly acknowledged their relationship. He moved on to other projects, other collaborations, continuing the pattern that had defined his career of intense creative partnerships that burned bright and fast before extinguishing. But those close to him noticed something had shifted. He seemed more cautious about getting emotionally involved, more aware of the cost of his need for control, more willing to let collaborators maintain their independence, even if it meant less intensive creative partnerships. Andy had changed him in ways that would ripple through the final years of his life, teaching him lessons he couldn't fully integrate, but couldn't ignore either. For Andy, the relationship with Prince became both a blessing and a curse. It opened doors, yes, and gave her experiences most artists only dream of. But it also cast a shadow she'd spend years stepping out of. Every article about her mentioned Prince. Every interview included questions about their relationship. Every accomplishment was measured against the success she'd had under his mentorship. Building her own identity meant constantly pushing back against the narrative that Prince had created her, that without him, she'd be nobody. The frustration of that, of never being allowed to just be Andy Allo the artist without the Prince footnote, sometimes made her wonder if the relationship had been worth it. But then she'd remember the music they'd made together, the late-night conversations, the feeling of being seen by someone who understood creativity on a level few people ever would. And she knew she wouldn't trade those memories for anything. When Prince died in April 2016, found alone in an elevator at Paisley Park, victim of an accidental fentanyl overdose, Andy joined thousands of others in mourning. But her grief carried layers that most people couldn't access. She'd lost her mentor, yes, but she'd also lost someone who'd known her in ways few people ever would. Someone who'd seen her potential before she'd seen it herself. Someone who'd loved her, even if that love came wrapped in control and possession and the complicated dynamics of their age and power differences. In her tributes to Prince, after his death, Andy spoke about the lessons he taught her, about his generosity as a mentor, about his uncompromising commitment to artistic excellence. But she also spoke, carefully and with obvious pain, about the impossibility of their relationship, about how loving someone doesn't mean you can stay with them, about how sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is let them go, even when they don't want to be let go. These weren't the sanitized celebrity tributes that dominated the media after Prince's death. They were honest and conflicted, acknowledging both what he'd given her and what the relationship had cost both of them. Years later, Andy Allo has built a career that proves her instincts were right. She's released multiple albums of original music that showcase her unique voice, blending indie rock, funk, and soul in ways that reflect her diverse influences without being dominated by any single one. She's acted in critically acclaimed television series, created her own production company, and become an advocate for artists' rights and independence. She's done all of this on her own terms, without compromising her vision or subordinating her identity to someone else's. It's exactly what she knew she needed to do when she walked away from Prince in 2013. Even though walking away meant leaving behind security and mentorship and love. But late at night, when she's alone in her own studio working on new music, Andy sometimes thinks about those sessions at Paisley Park, about the magic that happened when she and Prince were creating together, about the man behind the legend who made her feel like she could do anything. She thinks about that last message he sent, the one she never answered, and wonders what he really wanted to say. She'll never know now. That's the price of independence, of choosing yourself over someone else, of walking away before you lose yourself completely. The love story of Prince and Andy Allo doesn't have a happy ending, but it has an honest one, which might be more valuable. It's a reminder that sometimes love isn't enough, that genius can be both gift and prison, that the age gap between two people matters less than the power gap, that you can be grateful for someone and still need to leave them. Their 2 years together produced beautiful music and painful lessons, gave both of them something they needed, even if it wasn't something they could keep. And perhaps that's the most authentic kind of love story there is, the kind where two people genuinely care for each other but still can't make it work, where there's no villain and no perfect victim, just two imperfect humans trying their best and ultimately failing to bridge the unbridgeable gaps between them.